Hi, I'm Jose Anunciato, and you're watching the WebDev channel.
All right. So first let's take a look at some of the presentation here for how to work with HttpSession. Some of you have implemented the profile by passing an argument to the HTML page, passing the ID of the user. And that's fine for now. Now the problem with that is that is the client who is maintaining state, right? Is the client who knows who's currently logged in and knows about the ID, and passes this information to the server, which then the server can then can use this to know who to retrieve. Now the problem with that is that well, one of them, the client is maintaining state, and the other one is that the user ID is being exposed in clear text. So typically we would like to minimize any showing any personal information about the user that might identify the person, right? That so typically any information that we want to show between the client and server, if it's anything about user identity, we would like to perhaps maintain that secret or encrypt it somehow. At a minimum, anything that we could do on the server to maintain state, we could do that. Now, maintaining state on the server has its own challenges. Okay, typically the server doesn't have to deal only with one person; it needs to deal with hundreds of people, 1,000, tens of thousands. So if it needs to remember anything about any of those folks, it's going to have a higher footprint, memory footprint, right? I need to be able to remember multiple conversations with multiple folks, right? Now, by default, state HTML and HTTP is a stateless protocol by design, okay? Meaning the server typically can't tell who's it's talking to, right? It cannot distinguish between one HTTP request and the next, right? There's nothing in the protocol that allows you to do this, right? And this became a limitation on the types of applications you could build since the application, the client side could not have the server in any way identify it, right? So for instance, if I wanted to come in tomorrow and continue a conversation or have the server remember anything about me, there was no way for the server to remember anything. I had to re-authenticate myself and say who I was. And then once the server knew, then it could display content that was specific to me, right? So for instance, if I wanted to ask for the weather for my town, I would have to provide that information, and then it would display the content. But then every time I wanted any personalized information, I would have to again provide that stateful information. Me manually typing my zip code every single time the query went out, right? Or I wanted some mechanism that would automate some of this, right? That's when cookies were invented, right? As a mechanism where the server now could be asked to remember something, right? The server can now use additional meta information in the request HTTP header, right? Where the server could say, hey browser, since I can't tell who you are, can you please maybe store this in your local machine, and then next time you come back to me, so that I know it's still you, give it back to me, right? Because I know I created it, I generated it. If I see it next time, I'll know it's you. Okay, that will be a way that I can distinguish you from someone else. Okay, people got freaked out early on, saying they're tracking me somehow, and there's some privacy issues there. A lot of people were just turning off their cookies, right? But today, it's much more rare to see folks not participating in session tracking. It's become such a common practice. But yes, a cookie is the low-level infrastructure that allows us to maintain stateful information about folks. Okay. Now on the server side, the server so that you have to deal with the raw headers and cookies information. There were APIs that were written on top of this low-level cookie header mechanism, and it's wrapped up into an API called the HttpSession. Okay, the HttpSession is a Java API, right, that allows you to based on using cookie as a key, right, to have a piece of memory, right, a piece of CPU memory for the server to say, oh, from this cookie I have this piece of memory, and that other cookie from someone else I'll have this other piece of memory, right? And now you can have a piece of information, per person or per session, per cookie, and then you're free to put whatever you want in there. Okay. Typically, we could put some identifying information, such as maybe the current user who's logged in or not, right? And this is what this set of slides introduces. Okay. But yeah, so HttpSession is a Java API built on top of the cookie framework to be able to use create a little piece of memory. Now, this piece of memory. It typically is default. It's stored in the RAM of the CPU of the machine that's the server, right? And it's limited by the amount of memory that the server can instantiate from the local machine, okay? And it works fine just for maybe a couple dozen, maybe 100 people, especially with small pieces of memory. But typically you don't have just one CPU running in a large application. You don't just have one CPU. Typically, you have multiple CPUs, 2, 3, 4, in tandem, right? Round robin, depending on the load of the machines, different machines get a request, right? So typically, this session that was in a particular machine, right? Once you round robin the request to some other machine, you kind of lose session, right? Because it was in the other machine, right? So typically, these sessions, you configure them to be backed up into like a database. Right, instead of just a local CPU machine, right? And there's all sorts of configuration. Right now, we're not going to ask you to do any of that. We'll just stick to the common, to the default backed up HTTP session against the local memory of the server. Right, we're not going to ask you to configure that. So anyway, so let's look at the HTTP session API. So here's a controller, a REST controller that we've seen already, right? That we can map any number of URL requests, right? Gets and posts and puts and deletes. We already built some of those in previous lectures. So it's just like any other controller. And here's one of the first examples I'd like to show you. So here's a method that has been mapped to /API/session/set. Okay, it takes as argument an attribute and a value, so a name and a value, right? So this function gets invoked when the URL matches this, right? So it might be API session set, username Alice, for instance. Okay, so it's mapped to that. If that's the URL, this function executes. Okay, and what's doing here? It's parsing from the URL. It's parsing the attribute and the value. So it's parsing out these two values as strings. And notice that there's a third argument here. See that? Right? It's asking this function. It's asking for the HTTP session instance to be injected in here. Okay, this is a design pattern that's become very, very popular on server side. That the function gets whatever you ask of it, right? The infrastructure, the framework, in this case Spring Boot, parses your function. It looks at the method signature. It says, oh, you want session to be injected. You want me to call you with an instance of this. Okay, and that's what it does. The HTTP session is parsed actually from a higher object, the request object. The request object is an object that represents the current HTTP request that's coming from the client. Right. From that, the request object is actually the object that contains the cookie in the headers of the request. Right. So from that cookie, right, parses it from the request, an instantiated session object for you, passes it on to you, and now you can do things like such as these. You can say session dot set attribute, right? Whatever attribute name you want. It's just like this is like a hash table, right? You can store anything you want, right? As long as you know where you put it, you can later on retrieve it. Okay, as long as you know where you put it, you can say get attribute. Right. So this is me writing to that table, to that hash table, and what am I putting there? I'm just saying that this attribute has this value. Okay, that's all I'm saying. And what this will happen, what this will do is that later on in subsequent requests, right, I'll get the same session I got earlier. Okay, this session would have the same session for the same cookie. If it comes from the same client, right, it'll have the same cookie, it'll know that it's the same session, and it'll allow me to access the same exact hash table from before, right? Now, sessions are by default good for, by the default by 30 minutes, meaning that if the session hasn't has access within the last 30 minutes, right, the cookie's still good, the session's still good, it hasn't timed out. Right, if there hasn't been any inactivity, activity in the last 30 minutes, right, by default, the session is invalidated, right? Meaning I won't get the same session, and anything I had stored in there will be gone, right? So that's a way of the server to kind of clean up after itself, right? So it doesn't have to remember things about you, even though you're not interacting with me, and there's no way for the server to know whether you're still there. Right, people, very common, they come to a website and they leave. And the session's still there, lingering for 30 minutes, right? There's no way for it to know. Yes?
That means that by talking about URLs, the login, signed in, and then choose something else, and then go back and log in again.
Exactly. Right, you'd be able to access the session and say, is there a current user? If there is, somebody's logged in, right? If it's null, meaning nobody has logged in, okay? So I'm setting the attribute here. I'm just using a simple example. Some name equals Alice or whatever. I can store anything I want. This object can be of any type. Okay, this is a string, which is a key into a hash table, right? And this value can be of any type. A user object, for instance, right? I could put a user object in there. Here, I'm just doing a string into a string. That's it. Yes? Okay. So once it has been set, I can come back later, right? Notice another mapping. This says GetSession attribute, right? If I'm within those 30 minutes, right, I can say API session get and the attribute, right? If I'm asking for the username again, this will go and use the session. Notice that I'm asking for a second argument here, a session, right? And then I use that session to that attribute to look into that hash table and just retrieve whatever I had stored in there. Okay, and then notice that since I can store any object in there, I need to cast it back to whatever I had stored in there, right? If it was a user, I'll need to cast it to a user. If it was whatever, I'll have to cast it, right, to get at the original object, right? Because this just returns a generic object, okay? And for every time I hit I hit a new request, the timeout, the 30 minutes, start from 0 again. Right? So it looks for any inactivity in the last 30 minutes. But if there's any activity before the 30 minutes are out, the timer starts up again. Right? So, okay, you are active. You've been talking. We're in a conversation. Okay. All right, and then the last one is invalidate session. Here we're hitting session invalidate, and this is for you, for instance, to log out, meaning throw away anything I had stored in there. Right, make the session invalid. Maybe that cookie is new, so the server will send a brand new cookie, right, and it will invalidate the old cookie. Right, it'll time it out, so that when here you hit invalidate, meaning if you go back and do a get attribute, right, this will return null. There's nothing in there anymore. Right, so this will come back as a null. Okay, right. All right, so knowing those three things, we could implement a toy login, logout profile, and so on and so forth. So let's look at first register. So in register, so /API register might look something like this. The register, it would be mapped to API/register, okay? And you would pass as argument the user object, which would include, presumably, the username and password. That's it, right? Even though the user object might have other things in it, right now when we register, that's all I'm passing along, right? Some login credentials, right? And I'm asking for session, and what I'm going to do is we're going to stick that user object in the session, okay? Map to a key of current user. So I'll need to remember where I put it, okay? Typically this will be a constant somewhere, right, that you can configure. And it'll be there next time I come back, maybe when I do a profile page, when I need to go to a profile page. Also notice I'm not actually storing in a database, right? You would actually store in the database. Instead, what I'm doing, I'm just storing in a local array of users, right? So this is a toy example. You actually save it into a database, right? And then you will retrieve it from the database. Right here, we're just storing in a local user array, okay? And then I would just return the user. We're just echoing the user back to the client. That's all we're doing. Here's an example of using Postman to send a post to the server. I encourage you to download and install Postman. Right, that's a nice tool that allows you to, without a user interface, right? If you don't have a user interface, yeah, you can send sample posts and gets and puts and deletes. So here's in the headers. I'm not showing what the header is, but the header says the content type is application JSON. Okay, in the headers. In the body, we have a JSON object that says that's going to send the username and password. You would be doing this from jQuery, right? You'll be creating a user object like this. That's raw application JSON, and then we're going to post to /API/register. We send it over, and it's going to echo back that user object. Right? It's going to store it in the URL in the array. Okay. All right. Now that we store, typically we would now navigate to the profile. Okay. Notice that one thing you need to be careful is to navigate to the profile before you get a response back that the registration was successful. Okay. You might run into a race condition. Right, you sent the register request, and if you don't wait and you navigate to the profile, the actual storage of the user might not have been already done yet. Okay, so you want to wait until the response that the registration was successful, right, and then navigate to the profile. Otherwise, you might get to the profile and there's no one there, right? Only after you refresh the profile, now it's there. Okay, so careful with those race conditions, right? So now that I navigate to the profile page makes this request and says /profile. Notice that it's not passing as argument the ID of a user. Right now, the client now is stateless. Right, the client has no idea who just registered. Okay, and it shouldn't. Right, the client should be dumb. Right, it should only be have logic for display, look pretty, and give a good response to the user, right? So it comes back and say, hey, I don't know who's logged in, and so I'm in the profile page, and the profile page from the controller, from the service, the service comes back here in the profile. The profile is asking for the session. The session says, okay, is anybody in the current user? Right, this might return null, right? If I try to navigate to the profile page, there's no one logged in, no one registered, this returns null. There's nothing in current user. Okay. Here, we're assuming that there's somebody, and we're just going to return the current user back to the client. Right? So again, this might be null, or might be an actual user. Right? So if there is a user, we send it back to the client. The client can now display the user. You would typically go out to the database, right? Right? If this is not null, you can use the ID stored in the user object to go fetch the user from the database, right, and return that instance back to the client. Okay. Here we're just retrieving it from session. Typically, we go out to the database and fetch it, right, with the ID. Okay. Because this user object is just a user in the session, not the user in the database, right? Right. It's something we store in there only to know the username, maybe the ID in there. Okay. All right, so that's if it went to the profile. In the profile, I might hit logout. Yes. Go ahead.
Is there some special configuration that you do to get this to work? Because I can swear I did all of this, and no matter what, if I refresh the page,
Really?
the session it's not there.
Okay.
The thing that I said is wrong.
No.
So actually, in the page API, you write credentials. There is in the page API, you need to add something after that.
Where I do it.
So when you
All right. Why don't you discuss this offline? But no, the default one project that I created with Spring Boot was able to, the default web project was able to work. We can discuss offline. Yes.
What is it to store an instance of the
I'm sorry?
Where should we store the session instance to pass into this?
Yeah, you don't store it, right? That happens to you automatically, right? So when the Spring Boot framework sees that you're asking for the HTTP session, right? It parses from the request, right? That gets parsed from the HTTP request, from the headers and the body and all that. It parses it and looks at the cookie, and then uses that cookie to see if there's a session already instantiated. If there isn't, it'll instantiate an HTTP session instance. It'll pass it to you. Right? So this all happens in the background. You don't have to do this. Right? It just injects it to you in the method.
If we call it register and it takes the user intention, we will the user intention is not added.
Yes. Yeah. When you ask for it's using it's called inversion of control. Meaning you ask for the framework, hey, I have this dependency, and the framework will figure out to instantiate and pass it to you for you, without you having to. So what inversion of control tries to do is to simplify the management, the lifecycle of certain very special objects. In this case, the HTTP session. We don't want to handle the lifecycle. Instead, we're asking the framework to instantiate for us and pass it to us. Okay. Same thing in when we were parsing out these user objects, these parameters. Okay. This request body, right? This over here is actually parsing the you're getting the HTTP request. It's parsing the body, converting it from JSON into an instance, instantiates the user object, and then it passes it to you. So there's a lot of magic happening behind this behind this annotation. Okay, so there's actual code behind this. Right? Somebody coded it, right? And that's what it actually does. Right? It gets a request, parses the body, instantiates, and then passes it to you. So all these inversion of control have become very, very popular, and we'll see them again when we come back. Angular uses it a lot. Angular uses a lot of version of control design pattern. React doesn't add that additional complexity. A lot of folks actually prefer that. So let me do that. But some of the more mature frameworks have gone all this way, going this design pattern. Very, very common. Right. So if I want to log out, so here would be a /API logout. Again, I'm asking for the session, and then I could do session.invalidate, right? And then all my key will be invalidated. And here's using Postman to call the logout, sends it. And if you go to profile, then no longer you have user in the session. And finally, if I'm going to log in, I would pass in the credentials, which is included in a user instance with username and password. I'm asking the session, and I'm going to iterate. Here I'm iterating over the array of users I have locally, right, in the controller, looking for someone who has a username and password. If there is, I come back, and now I log them in. Right? I set the current user. If I found the user, I put it in the session, right? And then I return the user if I found it, or I return all if I didn't find it. Okay. Obviously here you would go out to the database, right? You would do a query, find user by credentials, right? Which would do a JPQL asking for a username and password, right? And then it would return the user or not, right? If it's there or not. And then you would set in the attribute, and then the login for the front end would then navigate you to the profile. The profile would do a query for the profile, right, for the current user, and would retrieve user that's currently logged in. Okay? Yes? Yes, you have to be consistent. Yeah.
Should we be taking it on the key?
Well, the key is some random text, right? It'll change every time, right? It'll be invalidated, and a new cookie will be created, right? So the key it'll change over time. You can't guarantee what the key is, right? Only the server knows what the key is, right? And oftentimes send it back to the client in encrypted as well.
So, but we read from the cookie.
You can read it from there. So what the session API does for you is that it takes that key and maps it to session object, right? Which is the same object as long as it's the same key for the cookie, right? When you get a different cookie, then the session is invalid. Anything you had stored there, it'll be lost. Right? It's no longer there, right? And what you get is the HTTP session, which is now your higher level map. Right? You can use your keys, or you can use whatever high level name you want to use, like current user. It has some meaning to you. Whereas the low level cookie is meaningless to you. It's very low level, very raw, right? But it's used to manage this entire HTTP session infrastructure. Okay, and then here's an example of posting some credentials to the login, and here's it's coming back that it found that user in the current user right from the session. All right? Yes.
So for this session thing, we are storing on a server only, right? I mean, it's not on client anywhere.
Yeah, the client doesn't know anything, right?
Just there's a one mapping like which says like this client is basically to the session. I mean like it's a hash map.
Yeah.
It's a hash map. Then this values there's all the detail about this user. It mapped to this client. Only this detail we store in client.
Yes. Yep. Yep. And so the client would be stateless, right? So ideally we don't want to rely on any information that is actually stored on the client. Whatever the client is displaying is only a snippet, right, of the latest information that it got from the server, right? The source of truth is the server that what's in the database. That's the source of truth, right? So the server is the closest thing to be at this to connect to a database, right? So the information, the latest information, will always be on the server.
So if client has turned off the cookies, then we have no web storing session or anything.
Nope.
So as login or sign up, if you're displaying page using this session, so that won't be a in some system it will work, in some browser it won't. I mean, if this sign up is totally based on this, showing of profile is totally based on this session.
Yep.
So we can't guarantee like if somebody has turned off the cookie, we can't show the profile page in that case.
They would have to log in. And so they would get their own cookie again, right? Every time you log in and you log out and then you log in again, you get a brand new cookie from anywhere in the world, right? From any browser in the world, right? You log in and you get a cookie, and now you have a session open, right? Any information conversation you have with the server is always within the context of that cookie, right? Which the session. We don't really talk about the cookie, right? We talk about the session, right? Cookies are low level. It's like talking about zeros and ones. Right? And if you're talking about Java, you're talking about objects and classes and whatnot. We don't talk about the low stuff. So
Configure what turning cookies means. Like if you're logging in, you're creating a session, you're storing data in your client.
yep,
Then if cookies turned off, then there is no way we can store anything.
exactly. If you turn off cookies, there is an alternative. Okay, there is an alternative. If you turn off cookies, the server can choose to go to what is called URL rewriting. Right. So what it will do is that it will add to the HTML that is being generated. It'll add some session information there. For instance, all the URLs. Okay. It will add a token there, right? So that every time you interact with the user interface, right? If you click on that URL, the token will be passed to the server, and the server can say, it's still you, right? So you had logged in, right? I generated a token. And now you're clicking on that URL, you're passing it back to the server, and the server says, it's the token, it must be you. And it maps it to the session for you, okay?
Like in a way we did for the last assignment, we were appending the user ID.
Exactly, yes. But that could be automated, right, without you having to do it yourself manually, okay? But that's a lot, like a last resort, right? Usually if you don't turn on cookies, I don't even want to talk to you, okay? All right, I'm not going to even bother. All right, so there it is. So HTTP session. Okay.
I hope you've enjoyed the video. Please subscribe, like the video, and share it. Thanks.